Welcome to episode 231 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. Today I'm going to talk about The Pretenders' debut album from 1979, released in 1980 in North America. It was put out on Real Records in the UK and on Sire Records in North America. This is a first Canadian pressing, which sounds pretty damn sweet. Apologies about my appearance. A couple of nights ago I was cleaning up from dinner and managed to go head over heels over top of our golden doodle and did a face plant on a slate kitchen floor. So my lip, well, it's come down a bit now, but it was about 8 times its normal size. So if I'm mumbling a bit, that's why. Pretenders are one of those bands that are admired across the rock and roll spectrum from punk to pop because from the very beginning they were popular, talented, but also super legit. As I mentioned, this is their first album. It's the world's introduction to the remarkable talents of Chrissie Hynde, their creative heart, their songwriter, and the only continuous member throughout the history of the band. It's a superb mix of punk, pop, and a little dash of Americana, which no one else has ever really been able to replicate. The story of the Pretenders starts and probably will end one day with the story of Chrissie Hynde. She was born in Akron, Ohio in 1951. Scholastically, she was an art student, and after graduating from high school, she went to Kent State University to study art. To a degree, she was caught up in the famous incident that happened at Kent State in May 1970 because one of the people that was killed was actually the boyfriend of a friend of hers. She was active musically while she was at Kent State, and she was in a band for a while with Mark Mothersbaugh, who of course goes on to co-found Devo. In 1973, at the age of 22, she heads off to London, and within a few months, she's landed jobs, first of all, as a writer at the New Musical Express, and then subsequently at Malcolm McLaren and Vivienne Westwood's uber avant-garde cutting-edge boutique, which was the home of punk fashion, or would be very shortly, Sex. Through McLaren and Westwood and through the boutique, she got to know the members of the future Sex Pistols and almost all of the burgeoning London punk scene before it was actually known as the burgeoning London punk scene. And at one point, when it looks like she's going to have to leave the country because she can't get a work permit, Sid Vicious actually goes with her to the registry office to get married, to do a marriage of convenience so she can stay. Didn't work out because the office was shut. But I don't think you can really overstate the chutzpah of somebody coming into the London music scene from Akron, Ohio, not knowing anybody in 1973, making the kinds of connections and getting the kinds of jobs and friends that she did in that period of time. Whatever she was destined to be, it was not to be ordinary. Her work permitless run in London ends in 1975. There's a period of time where she's back and forth between the US, the UK, and France. There's a couple of failed attempts to get a music career going on in France. And then she arrives back in London in 1976 as punk is really starting to take off. For the next year or so, despite her obvious talents and energy, she was always on the periphery of a whole bunch of key punk movements. She was in an early version of The Damned before they became The Damned. She toured with Mick Jones's pre-Clash band, but never really stuck with that, and expressed her frustration retrospectively that everybody she knew in that scene at the time was in a band. She desperately wanted to be in a band, couldn't get into a band. She was, however, pretty well connected. In addition to Mick Jones and McLaren and Westwood and the Sex Pistols, she also had gotten to know Nick Lowe of Rockpile, and that would be a connection which would pay off shortly. In early 1978, she makes a solo demo for Dave Hill, the owner of Real Records. He thinks it's great. He says, I want to manage you, and he steps in, clears up the temporary debts that she's got and anything which is causing her to have to work for a living so that she can actually focus on making music, and he says, get a band together. That spring, she meets her future bassist, Pete Farndon. Farndon had been in a local band in Hereford called Cold River Lady, and through that scene, he met the guitarist James Honeyman-Scott. Honeyman-Scott had been in a band, also in Hereford, called Cheeks, with a drummer called Martin Chambers. And so through Farndon, Honeyman-Scott and Chambers show up initially just to help rehearse, but at the very first rehearsal, according to all retrospective accounts, all 4 band members realized they had some real chemistry, a real connection, that they had found their future bandmates. Notwithstanding that chemistry, it took a while for the band members to learn how to play together, particularly the 2 guitarists, Chrissie Hynde and Honeyman-Scott. Hynde, as the main songwriter, as is typical of rhythm guitar songwriters, ended up very much being, and this is also typical of people like Malcolm Young and Tony Iommi, very much the timekeeper of the band as much as the bass and the drums. And Honeyman-Scott couldn't really lock into the beats, and what he ends up doing is figuring out how to play lead fills over top of her particular rhythmic signatures, which avoids him having to figure out how to lock in. You can hear this on several of their songs, the best example on here being Tattooed Love Boys. Once they had their sound down, they recorded the demo tape with several of the tracks which appear on here, including The Wait, Precious, and the Kinks cover they do, Stop Your Sobbing. They then give this to Nick Lowe, whom Chrissie knew from before, and he actually didn't think much of it, but he liked the Kinks cover, so he agrees to produce this one as a single. The single's released in January 1978, goes to number 33 on the UK charts. It's followed up by another single which does quite well, Air, and based on that success, in the summer of that year, they go into the studio to make the rest of the tracks for this record. This record is made on several different dates over the course of 1979 at Wessex Studios and Air Studios in London. Originally, the producer was to be Nick Lowe, but as I mentioned, he didn't really think that much of the band, didn't like Chrissie Hynde's songs. He departs the scene, and in comes Chris Thomas. Thomas is a guy who at this point had a really quite remarkable track record as a producer. He had produced large chunks of the Sex Pistols album Nevermind the Bollocks. He is uncredited, but is a producer and or a performer on 6 different tracks on the Beatles' White Album. There's a bunch of other highlights on his CV, like producing records for John Cale, 5 different records for Roxy Music, and, not least, mixing the record Dark Side of the Moon. So they had somebody who knew his way around the desk. Chrissie Hynde's on lead vocals, on rhythm guitar, and she also writes almost all of the songs. Pete Farndon's on bass, Martin Chambers is on drums, James Honeyman-Scott is on lead guitar and keyboards, and everybody in the band contributes backing vocals. The album's released in January 1979. Remarkably, for a debut album in that era, it goes to number 1 in the UK and number 9 in the US. Really unusual to actually achieve that level of chart success on both sides of the Atlantic for a band that's not that well known. Side 1 starts with Precious, classic Pretenders. It's punk, it's pop, Chrissie singing with all kinds of attitude, there's lots of swearing, there's lots of sex, there's parental guidance required. The next track, The Phone Call, introduces one of the signatures of this record, which is a bit of time signature jiggery-pokery. I guess you could call this record the Take 5 of post-punk classic records. Anyway, a pretty snazzy tune, and that's followed by Up the Neck, I think about a one-night stand, which ends up turning violence, rather intense energy to all this. That's followed by Tattooed Love Boys, which is another great rock and roll track, another kind of funky little time signature bit. Space Invader, kind of unusually, is an instrumental showpiece for the band, a showpiece more in terms of the feel and the intensity rather than virtuosity necessarily. The Wait is a great track too. It's a tight little number about a kid growing up rough, and that takes us to the final track on side 1, the cover of the Kinks, Stop Your Sobbing. Not easy to cover the Kinks. Ray Davies is a great songwriter, also a master of wry, cynical, somewhat ironic sentiment in his singing. Not easy to pull that off. To her credit, Chrissie really does. She even does a little impression of her future husband later in the track. Side 2 starts strongly with Kid, which is an interesting track because compared to the tough as nails Chrissie we had on the first side, here she's a lot more vulnerable lyrically. It's a great vocal performance on an album of great vocal performances, and the drumming here too is spectacular. After all the energy we've had so far, there's now another change of pace with Private Life, which is a fascinating track. It's not so much a ballad as it is kind of a down-tempo rocker with an almost R&B feel. It could easily, frankly, have been an Isaac Hayes song, and as it happens, Trace Jones goes on to cover it. Next we have the song which almost everybody remembers from this record, which became the theme to many a girls' night out and probably shows up in a variety of strip clubs as well, which is Brass in Pocket, a song which Chrissie Hynde hated at the time they recorded it, but it's made her a lot of money. Lovers of Today is another balladish song, which is not really a ballad, another great vocal performance. And that takes us to Mystery Achievement, the last track in the record, which has this great, very punk-based intro, another autobiographical song from Chrissie, this one about a former conquest who is named Mystery Achievement, and it grows and grows and grows. At the end, it's rocking really hard. Just a great way to end a really, really great record. The Pretenders, of course, had their greatest moment of commercial success later, many years after this record, when they released Learning to Crawl in the mid-1980s. After the deaths of Farndon and Honeyman-Scott, and that record was all over MTV, brought a whole new group of fans to the band. And some of those fans may never have delved back to hear some of these earlier tracks, which is a shame because this is an absolute classic. It has everything. It's got great lyrics, it's got great musicianship, it's got a punk sensibility, it's got vulnerability, it's got attitude, it's got musical experimentation and risk-taking, and most importantly, it rocks really hard. This amazing lineup would only continue for an EP and another album before the wheels fell off. They'd chart, of course, much higher in terms of singles and sales and publicity in the 1980s, but they'd never, ever, ever be this cool again. Luckily, we have this record to cherish, and for me, it's 5 out of 5 stars.